Welcome back to the Bible in Context, where context is king and the author's intent drives our interpretation. Nate's over here playing with his iPad. We're having troubles. All right. Last time we ended on a pretty good note, I think.
Yeah, so we finished talking about God and Jacob having this wrestling match. And
we learned that you should wear a cup if you wrestle God. That was your key takeaway. I like that.
Yeah. So anyhow, we wanted to go back to that story just for a few minutes and talk about some of the connections to the Exodus motif.
Yeah, because this section ties so well into just the whole story with Esau, or it doesn't tie well into it. It's an integral part of Jacob's deliverance from the threat that he perceives from Esau. And in the midst of all his own striving of trying to obtain what God has already given him, which is deliverance from Esau. And so I mentioned in the last episode that you're hearing a lot of face language. He sends a gift to Esau's face so that he may appease his face, so that he may lift Jacob's face. And then he sees God face to face, and he's been delivered. The face language just keeps on going. So I'm actually going to read a paragraph about this, just for simplicity's sake, from Through the Waters, just to demonstrate how this is working. And so, before this hand-to-hand encounter, by the way, this is, if you were to have the book and want to follow along, this is on page 136. And so it says, before this hand-to-hand encounter with Yahweh, Jacob feared seeing Esau face to face. In Genesis 32:20, Jacob attempts to use his gift to appease Esau's face with the present that goes before his face. Afterward, Jacob would see Esau's face and perhaps have his face lifted. In this chapter, the word face, panah, is a key word occurring 8 times by Genesis 32:21 and 4 times in Genesis 32:20 alone. The author highlights Jacob is in need of deliverance from the face of his brother. Therefore, when Jacob says in Genesis 32:30 that he has seen God face to face and his life has been delivered, he understands that he has received the deliverance that he asked for, not only from before Yahweh, but from before the face of Esau as well. Jacob later reiterates this understanding when he says, I have seen your face, speaking to Esau, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. And just a quick note, the word there, accepted, before Esau, is actually a term that is used very often in Leviticus to talk about acceptance. So we're just back to more ritual language, which if you go listen to the previous episode, if you haven't, that'll make sense. And so it's not that Jacob sees Esau as visually comparable to Yahweh in this verse, but by means of verbal repetition, the reader is brought back to Genesis 32:30, in which Jacob realized that his encounter and blessing from Yahweh, that he had received the deliverance for which he asked. So that's what's going on here. Face is a leitmotif, a word motif, a word pattern throughout this passage that both highlights Jacob's need and then intertwines with his conflict and deliverance with Yahweh, and then also follows up with a deliverance from Esau, which is actually, just thinking about this, that's actually kind of how the Jacob story works with Tamar and Judah. And we'll talk about this more later, but it starts off with like similar elements from Joseph and then some new elements you don't recognize. And you see those elements pop up again later in Joseph's story, and you start to know what's going to happen. And so it's almost like here we have Jacob is in trouble, and then he's in trouble with Yahweh, and then he's saved from Yahweh, and then he's saved from Esau. And so with all this repetition of face going on, since you know the face was related to Jacob's trouble and to his deliverance from Yahweh, when the face shows up in relation to Esau, you know, okay, according to the literary pattern here, Jacob is going to be delivered from Yahweh as well.
Gotcha.
And you know, I need to come back and look at this passage and see if the fact that Jacob was punched in the place that makes him fruitful, like we talked about last time, if that has any bearing on the fact that he has one more kid.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting, too, because the child is born soon after this.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if she was pregnant before this happened. And, like, it's possible. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I would like to, which I haven't done any study on this, which if any of you all know of any studies, send them in, because chapter 35 is one of the most enigmatic to me in Genesis, just because of the later... We'll talk about this when we get there, but some of the later references in Scripture back to that place. Yeah, and one thing that we need to just mention before leaving this story is in verse 31, it says, the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. And so at the end of this wrestling match, Jacob has the sun rising upon him, which we talked about before. That happens as Esau is fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah. It happens in the Exodus story as they're crossing through the Red Sea or coming out the other side, in some other places as well. But this, again, is a symbol of redemption, of rescue, of the Exodus being complete when the sun rises.
Right.
And again, I think that's where Micah picks up on his imagery. The sun will rise with healing in its wings. Like the Exodus, the new Exodus that Yahweh's bringing will be complete.
Yeah.
So
do you think that is what's going on too when... Yeah, so back in verse 26, when God says, let me go for the day has broken, there's a lot of commentaries that I read that interpret that they assume that what God is saying there is like, let me go because you don't want to see my face in the fullness of the day. But that doesn't jive with me a whole lot, because there's other places in Scripture where the angel of the Lord appears in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And I think back with Abraham, he appears in the noon of the day with him. So it just doesn't make sense that that's the purpose of let me go, because it's a new day.
It's the fight's over.
Yeah, I think it's just the fight's over.
It's deliverance time.
It's deliverance time. Yeah, I think that's what's going on here. I don't think, but there is so many commentaries that I read that talked about the importance of the wrestling match being over while it was still dark, so that he didn't see his full glory.
And we've crossed a few places like that where if you're just trying to read through and understand these as stories, how they all fit together, but you don't understand the prevalence of the Exodus motif, there's so much that you miss because you don't know how the dots connect and why elements of the story show up the way they do. And that was the question that led me to writing this book, was like, how do all these stories connect? Oh, look at all these little patterns that are showing up everywhere.
Right.
And that's why I think it's really important to try and, get this stuff before people who are commenting on Genesis, because it's like you won't understand Genesis fully until you see the Exodus motif playing out.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Just trying to get it out there. I think it's helpful. I think you need it to understand Genesis fully and to understand, we'll talk about this more with Joseph, I think we've mentioned it already, but to understand how you have a picture of what the Messiah is going to look like. I mean, from Genesis.
Right.
And so, there's all these debates that I've heard maybe early on when I was a Christian of how in the world is Jesus predicted in the Old Testament? And you pick these scattershot verses that don't actually refer to Jesus, and you say these are pointing to Jesus. It's like, no. Genesis and then the rest of the Old Testament is building a pattern that Jesus fits, rather than saying he's going to, his name's going to be Jesus and he's going to look like this, whatever. Anyway, different rabbit trail. Chapter 33. Let's change course.
All right.
Yeah. So, again, we're still here with Jacob, and he lifts up his eyes to look, and behold, Esau was coming. We see, again, just lifting up of the eyes to see. We saw that in chapter 22. It's kind of like just this climactic moment's about to take a head. Abraham looked up and saw the mountain where he was supposed to slaughter Isaac and so on.
Right, and then I'm trying to think, there was another spot that we saw that. Sarah's maidservant, when she was in the wilderness, she... looked
Hagar.
Up and Hagar,
she saw the
well. She looked up, lifted up her eyes, and behold,
that's right.
She saw the well that had been there all the time.
Yeah. Well, Jacob, we have a change of character now because we've been through the wrestling match. His conniving for his success has been somewhat dealt with. It's not going to be perfect, but it's been somewhat dealt with. And so when we came into the wrestling match, if you listen again to the last episode, Jacob was cowering.
Right, behind everybody.
Right. He was essentially on the far side of the river from Esau while he put his entire family in front of the river, closer to Esau. So basically, I guess, if they get attacked, he can flee, just like he planned to do with the two camps that he made. And so now he comes over, and in verses 2 to 3, he's still showing some favoritism here, but he takes the lead.
Yeah, so he goes in front of all of them now.
Yeah.
Where before he was staying behind to see what would happen.
Right, yeah. It says that in verse 2, he put the servants with their children in front, so some favoritism, and then Leah with her children, so servants, and then his least favorite wife, and then Rachel gets the back so she can survive.
Right.
And Joseph last of all.
Interesting.
So, and then he himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. So he's taking the lead. That's a good thing. He's leading his family through this risk, trusting in God at this point. But he's still, just in case, I'm going to put my favorite people in the back.
Right. Yeah, and how significant is that he puts Joseph in the way back?
Yeah.
Even behind Rachel.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so, again, the author could have just breezed by that and said, hey, Jacob took the lead now, we're good. But he's still showing us, he's grown a little bit in this, but there's still some problems.
Yeah, well, and the way that it's written it's so masterful because, you're meant to just ask the question, why is Joseph last of all? And, of course, you find out later on why.
Right.
But all these little nuggets that are meant to... You read it a second time, it's I missed that the first time.
There's so much... I'm excited to get to the Joseph story because there's so much in here. It's really cool. Yeah. But I'm glad you pointed that out, that Joseph gets put last of all, just showing that he's the family favorite.
Yep.
And actually, it doesn't mention any of the other... It mentions that the children are with their sons, but, it picks out Joseph explicitly out of all of them. Yeah. Yes, he's...
Doesn't mention any of the other sons.
Yeah, yes, he's Rachel's only child at this point, but he didn't have to name him.
Right.
It could have just said, just like the others, like Rachel and her child. In the back. It's no, it says Joseph.
Yeah.
So, okay. We get to verses 4 here, and it says, but Esau ran to meet him and embraced him. So, again, he prayed for deliverance, and he should have stopped. That would have been, he just comes to Esau, and he embraces him.
Yeah.
So, basically, he'd already forgiven, and however this happened, God prepared his way.
Yeah. Do you think Jesus had this story in mind when he was sharing the prodigal son story?
Maybe on the periphery. I think mostly it's about the people of Israel out in Babylon receiving new exodus and being embraced by the Father. But,
right. Well, just the idea that the Father ran to the prodigal son and embraced him, and so it's the same language there, that Esau ran to him and embraced him.
I'm completely rethinking what I just said. Huh. I wonder if through the pattern, Jacob is in exodus or exile, just like Israel will be, and so maybe there's kind of we're winking at you, Israel.
He's been the prodigal son.
I'm using the picture of
and Esau here is depicted kind of instead of the angry brother, he's the father. Yeah, which is really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, which Israel will immediately associate themselves with the Jacob prodigal son figure.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Wow. I hadn't really put the connection that in the prodigal son, the older brother is the angry, he remains angry.
Yeah.
And that's who Jesus is talking to, the Israelites that are bitter and angry. But here in this story, the older brother is more like the forgiving father.
Yeah.
In the story, which I think is really interesting.
Man. Okay. I need to find some kind of article on a literary reworking of this passage in that parable.
Yeah.
Because I wonder if in the Septuagint there's a lot of keywords borrowed from...
I don't know.
From this story in Jesus' parable.
Yeah. I had never thought about that until just now when we were talking.
All right. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while.
Yeah.
So let's keep going. Yeah.
Oh, well, look at this. And he fell on his neck and kissed him. Which,
right.
And
okay, I've got to look up later and see if those are the same words used in the parable, because I think you're right. There's some kind of reworking of the character roles a little bit, but this is what I think Jesus may be drawing on in a way that Israel will immediately link themselves to Jacob as being in exile, as they've been in Babylon and under Roman rule and so on. So this was not supposed to be a podcast on the prodigal son.
No, this was not in our notes at all.
But bonus. All right, that was good.
All right, so that was verse 4.
Yeah, in verse 4, shockingly, Esau embraces him and even tries to refuse the gift to Jacob. And so Jacob has more than been delivered here. He is being received back and welcomed and loved and forgiven. And so anyway, Jacob, he persists, to take the gift. We've already discussed the face theme, and so he's like, I've seen you face to face, like seeing you is like seeing the face of God. He's been delivered here. And then Esau even offers, in verse 12 as we go down, and through 17, Esau offers to stay with Jacob as he travels back. And then Jacob refuses that and says, okay, well, let me leave some of my servants to assist you for your journey back to Seir. And so they're talking about Jacob going to live in Seir with with Esau and dwell together. Jacob's not really refusing that. He's saying, yeah, that sounds good. And he says, you go on ahead. My flocks are slow. I don't want to hold up your servants. You go on ahead, and I'll just meet you there when I get there. And then he heads the other direction. And so I think this is, again, just pointing to Jacob, again, has grown and been delivered through this story, but he's not perfect. He's, again, deceiving his brother. He has business from God to go to Bethel. God told him to arise and go back and perform the vow that you made in Bethel. And so he's already seen God's deliverance. He should trust God's going to get him there. And instead of just saying, hey, look, Esau, my place is in this land over here that God gave me. I need to go to this place. God's going to see me through it. He lies to him again, needlessly, and says, yeah, I'll meet you in Seir, and then heads towards Canaan. And so after that, after this deception that he does once again, he comes to a place named Sukkot, or I think Sukkoth is how you probably know it in English. And Sukkot it's a really interesting place because there is a place with the same name that is the first stop that Israel makes after coming out of the Red Sea, after the Reed Sea, after coming out of the Exodus in Exodus 12:37, and it's also mentioned again in 13:20, I believe. Israel comes to Sukkot. And so again, just wrapping up this deliverance story, remember Jacob needed deliverance because he feared attack from Esau, and so he wanted deliverance from the hand of Esau, just like Israel is delivered from the hand of Pharaoh. And then he comes through this deliverance and comes to the same place that Israel does right after their deliverance.
Is there any significance to the meaning of the name Sukkoth?
Yeah, it means tents, booths. I mean, the Feast of Booths is the Feast of Sukkot, and so it's here explicitly. I don't think so. He names it Sukkot in the story at least because he sets up Sukkot. He sets up tents and dwellings, stables for his animals and stuff, and dwells there for a while. It sounds like. I don't know if there's anything more going on in this passage. Okay, and then he actually makes one more stop before this chapter runs out or ends, and that is in 18. Shechem. Yeah, Jacob comes safely to the city of Shechem. And Shechem is also another Exodus link, not to Israel's Exodus, but actually back to Abraham's Exodus. Because in Genesis 12:6, after he comes out of Babylon and comes to the Promised Land, he dwells in Shechem. And so we have just another link within Genesis to not the paradigmatic Exodus, but another Exodus in Genesis, all the same. This is where Abram came to the Oak of Moreh and had Yahweh's promise reiterated to him, and he built an altar, and so this was a really high point in in Abraham's Exodus story. So we get that kind of same association here through Sukkot to the Exodus, and then Shechem to Abraham's Exodus. Two really good ways to end this. And just real quick, I want to run through the Exodus points in this story just so we're kind of refreshed on it. So there are messengers sent ahead of Jacob. Remember, angels, same word, sent ahead. So listen to the previous episode if you haven't. It ties really well into this one. We don't have the inhabitants of enemy struck in this passage, but we do have Jacob getting struck, which is kind of an ironic twist on the Exodus motif. He is the same word used for plague shows up when he gets punched, and so that kind of shows up ironically. We have rescue from the hand of Esau, just like from the hand of Pharaoh. And then there is some, again, ironic priestly language here as Jacob offers this mincha, this gift offering to Esau in order to kippur Esau and have his face lifted. We talked about that again last time. And that just, again, parodies the sacrifices that other patriarchs make after their exoduses. There are further blessings to be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 32. 12, it's mentioned, and then in 29, explicitly when Yahweh blesses him after he wrestles with him. There's salvation in the morning, and then he comes to be rested in Yahweh's dwelling place, essentially as he comes back into the land and follows in Israel's footsteps as he comes to Sukkot and Shechem. So he's kind of coming back into Yahweh's land and more or less coming into Yahweh's dwelling, at least in a figurative kind of high point in the narrative sense. We already mentioned Sukkot, we mentioned Shechem, and then we're going to see that just like any good Exodus, it follows up with rebellion. He deceives Esau once again and doesn't finish it up properly. And he also doesn't go to Bethel like he should. He stops in Shechem, so that's a problem too. So, all right, that kind of wraps up chapter 33, and then we get to, now that he has essentially made a bad choice and stayed in Shechem instead of going to Bethel, some bad things are going to happen. So we'll talk about that in the next one with Dinah.
Sounds like a plan.